Tonight, a young woman steps into post-war Chicago with nowhere to sleep, no steady work, and a city determined to forget she exists. The war ended, but racism followed her everywhere: closed doors, slurs on the street, and the quiet fear that she might disappear in a place that promised a future. As the winter presses in, she begins a journey inward, fighting to hold her identity close while the world tries to take it from her. Settle in, breathe slowly, and let the night open around you. You're listening to Stories from Camp, produced by Redress Radio. These stories are created to help you rest while learning the lived history of Japanese Americans during and after World War II. Every episode is researched with care, reviewed for historical accuracy, and offered freely to keep this memory alive. If you want to support more work like this, like, subscribe, and help us continue telling the stories this country tried to forget. The City That Forgot You. Act 1. The suitcase still smells like dust. The train sighed as it eased into Chicago, the metal groaning as if tired from carrying too many hopes that winter. Aiko stepped down onto the platform, her shoes landing in a thin film of soot that had drifted in from the tracks. She paused a moment before taking another step, letting the cold bite her cheeks and steady her nerves. Her suitcase hung from her right hand, its canvas still faintly dusted with the gray-brown powder of the camp she'd left behind. She caught the smell of it rising with the steam: dry earth, sun-baked wood, soap flakes from the communal laundry rooms. The scent clung like memory. Aiko was 22, slight, with a rounded face that still carried traces of the girl she had been before the war. Her hair, once long enough to braid, was now cut just below her jaw in a practical line that curled inward from the cold. She wore a wool coat in a soft brown that wasn't quite the right size, a gift from a neighbor in the camp who insisted she look respectable for her new life. The sleeves covered her hands unless she pulled them back. A blue ribbon held her hair away from her eyes, a ribbon once owned by her younger sister who stayed behind in California. She felt that ribbon like a pulse, a quiet reminder of the family she carried with her even now. She stepped into the flow of people hurrying through the station, their coats brushing against hers, their steps quicker, their voices louder. The sound of Chicago wrapped around her, deep horns from streetcars outside, men shouting greetings, heels clacking across smooth stone floors. She felt invisible inside the crowd, but also strangely exposed, as if someone had turned a bright light on her and was waiting to judge what they saw. Aiko walked slowly, her eyes adjusting to the speed of the city. During the long night journey she had rehearsed her introduction to Chicago in her mind. She imagined meeting a landlord who smiled and showed her a tidy room. She imagined starting work in a sewing shop where her hands moved quickly over cloth and she surprised everyone with her precision. She imagined becoming someone new, someone unburdened by the years behind barbed wire. But standing in the station, pressed on all sides by strangers rushing home from work or rushing toward work or rushing toward anywhere, those fantasies felt suddenly thin. She adjusted the weight of her suitcase and stepped outside. The winter air was colder than she expected, the kind of cold that reached through her coat and found her bones. She pulled the sleeves down over her trembling fingers. Snow flurries lifted across the sidewalk, scattering like blown ash. For a moment she thought of the high desert winds of Tule Lake, dust rushing through the barracks cracks, settling in the seams of clothing, gathering under eyelids. The memory rose uninvited, and she forced herself to shake it off. This was supposed to be different. She was supposed to be different. Aiko made her way to the boarding house where she had written weeks earlier. The directions were written neatly in her notebook, each line slanted slightly to the right the way her mother's handwriting used to look. The streetcar rattled as she boarded, its windows trembling with each turn. She sat near the back, tucking her suitcase between her feet, her eyes drifting to the reflections in the glass. She saw herself there, framed by a moving city, a pale, tired face with dark eyes that carried too many stories she had never been allowed to tell. She wondered how many people here knew what had happened to her community. She wondered how many never cared to know. When she reached the address, the boarding house stood tall and narrow, its brick darkened by decades of winter. A single yellow light glowed from the window near the door. She climbed the steps and knocked. A middle-aged woman opened it only partway, her body angled as though she were protecting something behind her. Yes. Aiko offered a small bow of the head out of habit before stopping herself. I wrote last week. About the room. You said it was still open. The woman's eyes moved across Aiko's face, then her coat, then her suitcase. Something flickered, curiosity, hesitation, discomfort. Aiko couldn't read it quickly enough. Oh. The woman's expression tightened. Right. I got your letter. But the room's been taken. Just yesterday. Aiko's heart sank, though her face didn't move. I see. I apologize for the trouble. It's not your fault, the woman said, though her tone suggested otherwise. Good luck finding something else. The door shut before Aiko could speak again. She stepped back, feeling the cold creep over her cheeks. The wind had picked up, scattering snow across the steps. She stood for a long moment, the door's rejection echoing through her chest. She tried 2 more places on her list, each refused her within seconds. One landlord barely cracked the door before saying the word no with a tight smile, as though politeness could disguise fear or prejudice. By the time she returned to the main street, her feet ached, her coat no longer held warmth, and her suitcase felt heavier than it had that morning. The city moved around her the same as before, people hurrying past, unaware of how each closed door pressed tighter against her ribs. She drifted toward a small grocery, pulled in by the warm light inside. Maybe she could buy something small for dinner, just enough to keep her strength. As she stepped toward the entrance, a woman exiting the store glanced at her and slowed. The woman's eyes narrowed. Her lips curled. Then she muttered, clear enough for everyone nearby. Jap. The word struck Aiko like a fist to the chest. It wasn't new, she had heard it in camp, on the radio, whispered in barracks corners, but hearing it here, in her new beginning, broke something fragile inside her. The woman started to step around her, clearly expecting Aiko to shrink away. Instead, Aiko lifted her hand. Her palm met the woman's cheek in a single, clean motion. A sharp, bright sound cracked through the cold. The woman gasped, pulling back. People around them froze, staring with wide eyes, stunned that the quiet Japanese girl had dared. Aiko's breath came fast, her heartbeat loud in her ears. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt real, for the first time in days. She felt the anger she had swallowed for years rush to the surface. She turned, grabbed her suitcase handle, and walked away before anyone could speak. Snow clung to her hair. The street blurred through her tears. She didn't know where she was going next. She didn't know what tomorrow would look like. But she knew one thing clearly, cold and steady. This city would not learn her name gently. Act 2. The Shape of Hunger. Morning found Aiko awake before the sun, long before the streetcars rumbled or the steam pipes clattered awake in the walls. She slept in a temporary room above a bakery owned by an older Nisei couple who knew her parents distantly and offered her 2 nights until she found something steadier. The room smelled of yeast and warm sugar in the early hours, but the sweetness only reminded her how fragile her situation felt. She rose slowly, her breath visible in the cold air, and wrapped her coat close as she prepared for another day of searching. Chicago's winter light crept in pale and uncertain. The sidewalks carried thin sheets of ice, glittering under the lamplight like a promise and a warning. Aiko kept both hands in her pockets as she walked, fingers tucked in fists for warmth, her suitcase left behind for the first time because she needed to move quickly. She had written a list of sewing shops, department stores, laundries, and offices that might need workers. The list filled a full page, and she planned to visit every single one. She began with a factory. Women lined the tables inside, heads bowed, hands moving in practiced rhythm over spools and needles. A foreman with a thin mustache asked her about experience. She spoke calmly, explaining she worked in the camp's clothing repair shop and learned quickly. He nodded, then glanced toward the women sewing. She watched the exchange, a look from him, a pause from them, a slight shift in posture. By the time he turned back, his face had changed. "We're full right now," he said. "Try back in a few weeks." She stepped outside into the cold again. One rejection felt manageable. She told herself she would collect dozens of these before landing something. The second stop was a department store where mannequins stood in windows wrapped in coats she could never afford. She straightened her posture and practiced a smile before approaching the counter. The hiring clerk flipped through a stack of papers without looking up. "What's your name?" "Aiko Sato." The clerk's hands stopped moving. "We aren't hiring." If you could take my application." "We aren't hiring." This time, the woman looked at her, eyes traveling quickly from hair to shoes to the small envelope Aiko offered. Aiko understood the message. She tucked the envelope back into her coat and stepped away without another word. By noon she had visited 9 places. 8 rejected her instantly. One offered her the chance to clean floors for a wage too small to survive on. She took their form and thanked them anyway, then walked a few blocks before tearing it in half because she could feel her mother's disappointment in the back of her mind. Her mother had called her gifted. Her teachers had called her promising. Her friends in camp said she was the one who would make it. How could she explain this? She stopped by a small diner to warm her hands around a cup of coffee she couldn't afford. The waitress never smiled. The other customers never looked in her direction. She sat alone at the counter, back straight, trying to decide if loneliness felt heavier in a crowded room or an empty one. When she left the diner, she turned a corner and nearly collided with Caleb. He held a cigarette between 2 fingers, exhaling a long stream of smoke that curled around his face. He wore a brown wool coat, collar popped against the cold. His hair was slicked back neatly, his jaw sharp beneath the morning stubble. He smiled as soon as he saw her, though the smile didn't reach his eyes. "There you are," he said, tossing the cigarette into the street. "Where've you been hiding?" "I walked past that bakery and they said you left early." "I went to look for work." "Work?" He laughed quietly, as if she'd told a joke. "You should have told me. I know people in this city." She didn't believe him, not fully, but the warmth of being acknowledged, being seen at all, felt like relief after the cold indifference of the morning. "I thought I'd try on my own," she said. Caleb stepped closer, adjusting the collar of her coat as if she were a doll. You're stubborn. Cute, but stubborn. Aiko didn't like the way he said cute. It felt like something small and breakable, not something strong. He noticed her hesitation and raised an eyebrow. What's wrong? Nothing, she said, because it was easier. He slipped his hands into his pockets. Come on. I'll walk with you. You shouldn't be wandering around alone. This city isn't gentle with girls like you. Girls like you. The words stung, even if he meant them as protection. She wondered what he saw when he looked at her. Exotic? Curiosity? Possession? They walked together through the slush-covered sidewalk. His stride was confident, sure, while hers was careful, deliberate. She told him about the rejections, the way people barely let her speak before dismissing her. That's just how things are, he said. People are tense after the war. You know. No, she said softly. I don't know. He didn't hear the edge in her voice or pretended not to. Instead, he changed the subject and talked about a party he attended the night before, a smoky room filled with men who boasted about future business ventures. He said she should come next time. You'd look nice on my arm, he added. Aiko stayed quiet. She didn't want to exist as someone's decoration. But she also didn't want to lose the only person in the city who even remembered her face. They parted after he insisted on buying her lunch. She thanked him, even though the gratitude sounded thin in her mouth. When he kissed her cheek before leaving, she felt the heat rush to her face, half from embarrassment, half from confusion. It wasn't unpleasant. But it wasn't comforting either. Later that afternoon, Aiko tried 3 more places. With each rejection, her steps slowed. Her throat tightened. Her hope thinned like cheap fabric being pulled too hard. By the time the sun dipped behind the tall buildings, she felt the hunger of the day settle deep in her stomach. She hadn't eaten since morning, and the cold made everything ache. She stood on a bridge overlooking the dark water. Snow swirled around her, catching in her hair, melting on her cheeks. She rested her gloved hands on the railing and let her shoulders sag. This city didn't know her. Didn't want her. Didn't bother hiding it. She closed her eyes. The camp had stripped her name from the world, but Chicago was stripping the world from her name. Still, she whispered to the wind, almost like a promise to herself. I will not disappear. And with that, she turned back toward the lights of the city, knowing she had to keep searching, even if the hunger gnawed deeper each day. Act 3. The boyfriend who could save her, maybe. Caleb waited for her outside the sewing shop 2 days later, leaning against a lamppost as if he owned the whole block. His coat caught the late afternoon light, its wool glowing in a soft amber that made him look warmer than the world around him. He smiled when he saw her, the kind of smile that suggested he expected her to be grateful for his presence. Aiko tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and approached with cautious steps, the cold wind tugging at her coat. She hadn't planned to see him, but she hadn't planned anything that day. Rejection tended to push her into drifting. You look tired, Caleb said, eyes sweeping over her face. Rough morning? I applied to 6 places. And? They said no. He let out a breath that clouded in the air. People here are paranoid. Still think Japan's planning something. Ridiculous, isn't it? He said it lightly, as if it were a funny inconvenience rather than a wound she carried in her lungs. Anyway, you shouldn't worry. I'll make sure you're fine. Something about the certainty in his voice both comforted and unsettled her. Aiko forced a polite smile. I appreciate that. I know you do. He reached out and adjusted the collar of her coat again, the gesture practiced and proprietary. Come on. Let me take you somewhere nice. They walked together through the busy street, boots crunching through patches of snow that refused to melt. Caleb talked about everything: work, politics, men who owed him favors, arguments he won at bars the night before. She found herself nodding along, even though she carried no interest in any of it. He seemed to enjoy the sound of his own stories, and she supplied the quiet he needed to fill their shape. Aiko's mind drifted as he talked. She thought of her father, who once told her she would grow into someone remarkable. She thought of her mother, whose hands guided fabric with ease and taught Aiko how to recognize quality in a seam. She wondered what they would think of her now, walking beside a man who spoke over her without noticing he did it. They ducked into a tavern with warm lighting and booths that smelled of varnish and beer. Caleb ordered for both of them before she could speak. She told herself it didn't matter, it was only a meal. The waiter returned with stew for her, steak for him, and 2 glasses of whiskey ginger. Caleb raised his glass. To new beginnings, he said. Aiko lifted hers cautiously. To new beginnings. He watched her drink, eyes gleaming with a flicker she couldn't name. You know, he said, leaning back comfortably, you don't need to run around the city chasing jobs like a stray kitten. I can help you find something. I can talk to people. I want to find work on my own. You're stubborn, he said again. There was amusement in his voice, but also something sharper. You don't have to be. She lowered her gaze to her hands resting on the table. Her fingers were dry from the cold, thin lines cracking at the knuckles. She remembered sewing for hours in the camp's clothing room, organizing stacks of donated garments, stitching torn sleeves, repairing blankets so thin they barely held together. She knew she was capable. She knew she worked hard. But here, none of it seemed to matter. Caleb reached across the table and traced a finger along the back of her hand. His touch felt warm and heavy, as though it implied more than she had the energy to sort out. You're different from other girls, he murmured. Aiko breathed softly through her nose. Different how? You think too much. You care too much. And you don't act like the girls around here. He paused, searching for the word. Exotic. The word hit her the way a pebble hits the surface of a pond, small impact, but the ripples traveled deep. She sat still, letting the burn of embarrassment settle under her ribs. She wanted to correct him, to tell him she wasn't an object to be inspected, but the words caught behind her teeth. Later, when they stepped back into the night air, he wrapped an arm around her waist. His grip tightened as they navigated an icy patch on the sidewalk. She leaned away slightly, but he didn't notice. Or didn't care. Let's walk you home, he said. It's too cold to wander. She didn't want him to know she still slept above the bakery. She didn't want him to see the cot pressed against the wall or the cramped room that echoed the barracks she thought she had left behind. I'll be fine, she said. I can get there myself. He stopped walking. Why won't you let me help you? I just need space. That's ridiculous. His voice sharpened. I'm trying to be good to you. The cold cut through her coat. Her shoulders tensed. I didn't say you weren't. Well, it feels like it, he said, running a hand through his hair. You act like you don't trust me. Aiko inhaled slowly, letting the breath settle the tremor in her chest. I'm grateful. Truly. But I need to stand on my own. Caleb looked at her for a long moment, his jaw tightening before he forced another smile. All right. Have it your way. For now. He leaned in and kissed her cheek again, lingering longer this time. Then he stepped back, winked, and disappeared into the flow of people along the street. Aiko stood still until he was out of sight. The wind tugged at her hair and numbed her fingertips. She couldn't tell if she felt relieved or lonelier than before. She didn't want to be isolated. But she also didn't want to disappear inside someone else's expectations. The streetcar bells clanged in the distance. Aiko pulled her coat tighter and began the long walk back toward the bakery, her boots leaving thin tracks in the new snow. She replayed the conversation on the way, searching for answers in the padded silence between her footsteps. She wanted a future. She wanted dignity. She wanted to feel human in a city that treated her like an afterthought. She wanted something steadier than Caleb, but steadiness felt like a luxury she couldn't afford yet. When she reached the bakery door, the smell of warm bread lifted to meet her. It felt like a small mercy after a day that stripped pieces from her. She climbed the stairs, each creak sounding like a question she didn't have the strength to answer. Inside her room, she sat on the cot and removed her shoes, rubbing warmth back into her toes. Snowflakes still clung to her hair. She stared at her hands again, hands that once believed they could make anything possible. She whispered into the dim room, barely audible, as if confessing to herself alone. I don't know who I'm becoming. And the silence that followed felt like an answer she wasn't ready to hear. Act 4. The Japanese men she won't choose. The next week blurred into a dull rhythm of cold mornings, long walks, polite rejections, and evenings spent in the bakery loft where the heat drifted unevenly through the walls. Aiko tried to keep busy, to keep moving, to keep her mind from spiraling into the places she refused to revisit. She told herself she had options she simply hadn't found yet. Chicago felt endless that way, a maze with doors she had not tried, corners she had not seen, possibilities she believed must exist somewhere. But each day chipped away at that belief. One morning she visited a laundry that needed help folding sheets. The air inside the room steamed with warmth, the machines rumbling like steady thunder. A young Japanese man worked behind the counter, neatly stacking towels with the precision of someone who depended on it. He glanced up as she approached, and his expression softened. "You're here about the sign?" he asked. "Yes. If it's still available." He nodded. "The owner's in the back. She'll talk to you." He paused, his eyes settling on her face. "You're new to Chicago?" "A few weeks." "That explains it," he said with a small smile. "Everyone looks tired here, but you look new tired. The kind that still believes it'll get better." Aiko blinked at him, surprised by the warmth in his tone. He extended a hand. "I'm Kenji." She hesitated before shaking it. His grip was gentle, grounding. Something in her chest eased for a moment. When the owner arrived, she looked Aiko over from head to toe and shook her head. "I'm sorry," she said, though her voice held no apology. Position's been filled. Aiko nodded, thanked her, and turned to leave. Kenji watched the exchange with a faint frown. They didn't even ask your experience, he said quietly. It's fine, she murmured. It isn't, he replied. You deserve better. She offered a small smile and stepped outside before he could say anything more. She knew what might come next and offered to walk her somewhere, a suggestion to get tea, a gentle kindness she no longer knew how to accept without feeling trapped. She wasn't ready for someone who understood her. She wasn't ready for someone she couldn't keep at arm's length. Later that afternoon, while taking refuge in a small Japanese grocery store, she ran into Hiroshi, a Nisei student she had met on the streetcar once. He wore round glasses and carried books pressed to his chest. He lit up when he recognized her. Aiko-san. You're settling in okay? I'm trying. I'm going to a small gathering tonight, he said. Some friends from school. Poetry, music, nothing fancy. You should come. Her breath caught. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to sit in a warm room filled with familiar voices, to listen to someone read poetry in Japanese without feeling ashamed. But something inside her tightened, a small, sharp knot she couldn't untie. I have plans, she said. Hiroshi's smile faltered. Another time, then? She nodded, hoping her face didn't reveal the truth, that she didn't trust herself around people who reflected her too clearly. It felt safer to drift at the edges of Chicago, invisible, rather than risk the pain of being seen by those who shared her scars. She left the store quickly, her heart unsettled. She could still hear Hiroshi's hopeful tone, the disappointment he tried to hide. She couldn't explain the feeling. But being near other Japanese Americans reminded her of everything she hadn't figured out. Who she was. Who she should be. Who she was allowed to become. And she feared that choosing someone like Kenji or Hiroshi would mean choosing a version of herself she no longer trusted. As the evening fell, the streets flushed with a muted orange glow from the lamps overhead. Aiko wandered toward the neighborhood where Caleb worked, almost without meaning to. His attention had become something she leaned on without knowing why. Maybe because he expected so little of her identity, even if he misunderstood nearly everything else. She didn't want to date him. She didn't want to date anyone. But she also didn't want to sit alone in a room that reminded her how small her world had become. When she reached the doorway of his workplace, Caleb spotted her through the window. His grin came quickly, confidently, as if her arrival confirmed something he already believed. There you are, he said, stepping outside and draping an arm around her shoulders in a way that felt both protective and possessive. Come inside. Warm up. Aiko let herself be guided through the doorway, unsure whether she moved from choice or exhaustion. She didn't want him. But she also didn't want herself, not the version who kept falling apart between rejections, who couldn't accept kindness, who kept choosing distance over safety. She sat beside Caleb in the warm room, listening to his laughter and feeling the tension in her chest loosen just enough to breathe. She told herself she would only stay for an hour. She told herself she still had options. She told herself she could leave at any time. Her heart knew each of these was half a truth. And half-truths were the only things the city gave her now. Act 5. The apartment that doesn't want her. The snowfall thickened over the next few days, drifting against windowsills and piling in soft ridges along the curbs. Aiko wrapped her coat tighter each morning, stepping into the cold with the determination of someone who believed she had no choice but to keep moving. She kept a list of new boarding houses in her pocket, notes written neatly in pencil, each address a small hope waiting to be tested. She walked longer distances now, learning which neighborhoods felt hostile and which felt merely indifferent. Silence had become her companion, walking beside her like a shadow. By midweek, the bakery owners pulled her aside after breakfast. They were gentle, apologetic, soft-spoken. Their eyes told the truth before their words did. They needed the loft space back. A relative from California had arrived unexpectedly, already fragile from the loss of her husband, and they didn't have another room to offer Aiko. The apology stung, not because it lacked sincerity, but because she knew they were right. She nodded, thanked them, and said she understood. Understanding didn't make it hurt less. She spent the morning circling through neighborhoods where the buildings leaned close together, their bricks dark with age. At one place, a woman peeked through a lace curtain and shook her head before Aiko could even knock. At another, a landlord told her the room had been filled but kept eyeing her face, as if waiting for her to argue. She never did. Aiko felt her voice thinning day by day, growing quieter as she swallowed each rejection without protest. In the early afternoon, she reached a small building near the river, its entrance tucked beneath a black awning. She waited at the door until a woman in a heavy coat approached, her arms full of groceries. The woman glanced at her, hesitated, then opened the door wide enough for Aiko to slip inside. The room smelled faintly of boiled cabbage and kerosene. A man behind the desk looked up over his newspaper. He had broad shoulders and deep lines carved around his mouth. "You're here for the room?" "Yes," she said. "If it's still available." He studied her carefully, his gaze lingering longer than she liked. "Where are you from?" "California." "Before that?" The question dropped like a stone. Aiko kept her breath steady. "I was relocated. From Tule Lake." Recognition flickered across his face. Not compassion. Not anger. Just a shift. A subtle tightening at the edges. "I see," he said. He leaned back in his chair. "Rooms taken." Aiko's jaw tightened. "Your sign says vacancy." "It was taken an hour ago." "I understand." She turned, walking toward the door before he could dismiss her again. As she stepped back into the cold, she felt a small crack open inside her, thin, sharp, dangerous. By dusk, her feet ached and her shoulders slumped from the weight of her coat and her last scraps of hope. She returned to the bakery, ready to gather her things. The owners met her with sympathetic eyes and a warm bag of leftover bread. She thanked them, bowing her head, embarrassed by how grateful she felt for something so small. Upstairs, she packed her suitcase slowly. The room looked smaller without her coat hanging from the chair, without her notebook resting at the edge of the cot. She smoothed the blankets one last time, as if tidiness might soften the goodbye. The window rattled gently in the wind, and she imagined for a moment that she was back in the barracks, listening to the desert storm whistle through the cracks. She slung the suitcase over her shoulder and made her way down the narrow stairs. Caleb stood outside the bakery door, hands buried in his coat pockets, breath lifting in white curls. Aiko startled when she saw him. "You didn't tell me you were moving," he said. "I only found out this morning." "Where are you staying?" She hesitated. "I'm not sure yet." He shook his head, stepping closer. You can't wander around alone at night with a suitcase. You're coming with me. I don't want to impose. You're not imposing. I wouldn't offer if I didn't mean it. She looked away, her breath trembling slightly in the cold. She didn't want to rely on him. She didn't want him to see how precarious her life had become. But she also didn't have another door to knock on that night. Caleb placed a hand on her shoulder, his palm warm through her coat. "Come on," he said softly. "Let's get you somewhere safe." She nodded, because the wind cut through her resolve and the night stretched too wide to face alone. As they walked together down the darkened street, Aiko kept her eyes fixed on the ground ahead. Snow drifted around them, catching on her hair, melting on her cheeks. She felt the weight of her suitcase with every step, felt the weight of her choices pressing into her spine. She didn't know if she followed Caleb out of necessity or fear, or if the line between the two had blurred beyond recognition. Behind her, the bakery light dimmed and vanished. Ahead of her, the city opened into a place she no longer trusted. And Aiko felt, for the first time, the full truth of her new life. She was one mistake away from disappearing into the city completely. Act 6. The house where she isn't a daughter anymore. Caleb led her through streets that grew quieter as the night settled in, the lamps casting long shadows across the snow. His hand rested on the small of her back, steadying her when she slipped, guiding her forward with a confidence that felt both reassuring and intrusive. When they reached his apartment, a narrow walk up above a corner hardware store, he unlocked the door with a flourish, as if presenting something grand. The room inside was sparse and smelled faintly of old wood and pipe smoke. A single lamp glowed in the corner, revealing a worn sofa, an unmade bed, and stacks of newspapers leaning against the wall. "You can stay here a few days," he said, taking her suitcase before she could protest. "It's warmer than whatever loft you were in." Aiko stepped inside slowly, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. She thanked him, her voice small, uncertain. He brushed off her gratitude with a shrug and offered her the bed, insisting he would take the sofa. She didn't argue. Exhaustion settled over her like another layer of clothing. She sat at the edge of the mattress, unbuttoning her coat one clasp at a time. Caleb lingered in the doorway, watching her carefully before muttering a good night and retreating to the sofa. Sleep came slowly, interrupted by the sounds of the city, streetcars clattering along the tracks, distant horns, the soft murmur of footsteps outside. The room felt unfamiliar, not quite safe, but safer than the cold streets she had nearly faced alone. When dawn seeped through the window, she rose quietly, folded the blanket, and crept into the small kitchenette to make tea with the little she found. Caleb stirred awake, rubbing his eyes. "You don't have to do that," he mumbled, though he accepted the cup gratefully. "You're too polite for this city." "I'm trying," she said. He smirked. "Trying is better than most." Later that morning, she left to search for another place to stay, something she could afford, something that wouldn't vanish the moment she revealed her name. She walked through neighborhoods where clotheslines hung between buildings and smoke spiraled from chimneys. She met another Japanese woman outside a small market who recognized her family name and led her to an apartment shared by distant cousins recently resettled from Topaz. The door opened to reveal a narrow hallway lined with shoes. Voices spilled from the back room, women gossiping, children squabbling, the hum of a radio turned low. The air felt thick with warmth and noise. The cousin who greeted her was older, with steel-gray hair pinned neatly at the back of her head. Her expression softened when Aiko introduced herself. "You can stay," she said simply. 1 week. Maybe 2. After that, we will see. Aiko bowed her head in gratitude. The room she was offered was barely large enough for a mattress and trunk, but it had a door she could close, and that felt like a luxury. She unpacked slowly, placing her ribbon on the small shelf, smoothing the blanket across the bed. But as the day passed, the apartment's closeness pressed against her ribs. The sounds of cooking, arguing, and laughing drifted through the thin walls. The children ran through the hall, their feet pounding against the floorboards. Every time she crossed the kitchen, her aunt's eyes followed her, assessing, measuring. "You must help with dinner," the aunt instructed. "Of course," Aiko replied. "You must clean the hall." "Yes." "Be grateful." "I am." But gratitude tangled with something heavier. Each instruction reminded her she was a guest, not a daughter, not a niece in the way she once imagined family would feel. She folded laundry with practiced precision, swept floors, helped peel vegetables for the hot pot simmering on the stove. Yet every task carried a silent judgment beneath it, an unspoken reminder that she now lived in a space too small, too crowded, too strained to hold her comfortably. In the evenings, she retreated to her narrow room, hugging her knees to her chest and listening to the muffled conversations outside her door. The laughter from the living room kept her awake. The tension in the kitchen kept her cautious. She felt suspended between obligation and isolation, unable to rest in the comfort she had hoped family might provide. One night, she overheard her aunt murmuring to another woman. "She has no stability," the woman said softly. "No job. No man. No prospects. She must learn," her aunt replied. "The world won't be kind to her." Aiko's breath caught, and she pressed a hand to her sternum to steady herself. Their words were not cruel, but they carved through her with precision. She stood quietly, listening as if their voices carried a truth she had tried to outrun. Later, she stood by the window of her small room, watching the city lights flicker against the falling snow. She felt suspended between two worlds, too lost to cling to her community, too unsure to trust the life she imagined for herself. She didn't know which path led forward, or if she was meant to walk any path at all. She wished home felt like home. She wished the world felt less heavy. She wished she didn't feel like a visitor everywhere she went. The cold glass against her palm steadied her breath. She closed her eyes, trying to remember the sound of the desert wind from Tule Lake, trying to remember who she was before the city began stripping her down. In that quiet, she whispered a small truth to herself, one she wasn't ready to share with anyone else. "I don't belong anywhere." And the ache that followed sat beside her like a quiet companion. Act 7. The city that keeps swallowing her. Days slipped by in a rhythm she could not control. Morning brought the same cold floors, the same crowded kitchen, the same practiced smile she wore to avoid questions she couldn't answer. She kept searching for work, walking streets that felt longer each day. Her shoes scuffed thin along the soles, and the wind lashed harder across the river as January settled in with a kind of unforgiving permanence. The city felt larger now, not with opportunity, but with 100 places she already knew would refuse her. One afternoon she visited a sewing factory on the south side, a cavernous space where machines clattered endlessly and lint drifted like pale snow through the air. The manager, a sharp-eyed woman with a scarf tied tight under her chin, watched Aiko's hands as she demonstrated a simple stitch. The work felt familiar, steady, almost comforting. She finished the final knot with precise fingers, hoping the neatness spoke for itself. The manager examined it, nodded once, then said they would call her if a spot opened. Aiko recognized the tone. It carried no promise. She left without waiting for more. Her hours cut at the small shop earlier that week had come quietly, a simple notification from the owner that they needed family members first and she would be contacted if they needed seasonal help. That left her with more free time than she wanted and far less money than she needed. She tried not to think about the dwindling bills tucked into her notebook, the ones her mother had once given her just to feel safe. Caleb noticed her tension whenever he visited the apartment to walk her somewhere warm. He stepped into the doorframe one evening, leaning on the jamb while she folded blankets in her tiny room. "You look worn out," he said. "Come out with me tonight. Get your mind off things." She shook her head. "I'm tired." "You're always tired." She didn't reply. Caleb stepped inside, lowering his voice. "Let me take care of you a little. You don't have to keep doing everything alone." His concern sounded genuine, but the way he said take care sat uneasily in her stomach. She agreed anyway, because refusing always led to more questions, and questions led to conversations she had no energy to navigate. He brought her to a quiet bar where he spoke loudly with friends and introduced her as the girl I'm seeing. She forced a polite smile, sipping soda water slowly so she didn't have to drink the whiskey he pushed toward her. When his friends left, he leaned close. "You should move in with me," he said. "It'd be easier." Her breath stilled. "Easier for who?" "For you. For us." He shrugged. "You're staying at your aunt's place, right? You don't belong there." Belong. The word struck deeper than he realized. "I'm fine where I am," she murmured. "Are you?" His jaw tensed. "Because it seems like your life's falling apart piece by piece." His voice wasn't cruel, but it dug into her anyway. She finished her drink quietly and told him she needed to go home. He walked her back, irritated but masking it with a forced gentleness at the door. Inside the apartment, the air felt thick and restless. Her cousins murmured in the other room, discussing someone's job prospects, another school application. They seemed to be moving forward with their lives while she wandered in place. She slipped into her room and closed the door, letting her back slide against it until she sat on the floor. Her hands trembled as she folded them into her lap. She wondered whether she had ruined herself in ways she couldn't articulate, ways that began long before Chicago. The camp had trained her to stay quiet, to not draw attention, to shrink herself until she fit behind the idea of good behavior. But Chicago demanded the opposite, a voice she didn't know how to use, a certainty she didn't feel, a confidence that had been scraped thin by years behind a fence. The next morning she forced herself to visit a community center for displaced Nisei. The room buzzed with people studying newspapers taped to the wall, job listings, boarding houses, meetings for resettlers. Conversations rose and fell around her. She drifted among them, reading postings that felt distant, written for someone with a steadier spine. A young man greeted her with a polite bow of the head, asking if she needed help. She thanked him and stepped away quickly, unable to hold his gaze. She feared that talking to him would expose everything she was failing at. In the afternoon, she walked along the river, where the water moved slow and dark under the ice. The wind cut across the surface, bringing a briny sting that made her eyes blur. She rested both hands on the railing, head lowered. The city roared behind her, streetcars clanging, men shouting over carts, children laughing as they skidded across patches of ice. She felt removed from all of it, suspended between worlds with no foothold in either. Her aunt's tension with her grew, subtle but constant. Aiko folded laundry too neatly. She cleaned the kitchen too slowly. She spoke too softly. At dinner her aunt commented on how long she had been without steady work, noting it with the same tone she used when pointing out a stain on the tablecloth. "You need to settle down," her aunt said one night. "Find a husband. You cannot float forever." Aiko bit the inside of her cheek, swallowing the heat rising in her chest. "I'm trying to find work." "There is more to stability than jobs," her aunt insisted. "You're not a child anymore. You must choose a path. Choose a path." The words squeezed around her heart. Her mind drifted to Kenji's warmth, Hiroshi's kindness, the way both had looked at her with recognition instead of curiosity. But choosing someone like them felt like stepping backward into a version of herself she didn't know how to trust anymore. With Caleb, she at least knew how to pretend, not happily, not confidently, but consistently. The next morning she woke before dawn and sat at the edge of her bed, watching the soft blue light seep through the curtains. She pressed her palms together and rested her forehead against them, breathing deeply. Her chest felt tight, as if the world kept pressing inward. She whispered to the quiet room, steadying herself for another day she didn't feel ready for. "Please just let me hold on." The city did not answer. It never did. But she rose anyway and stepped out into the cold, letting the wind take her where it wanted, because she still believed, somewhere beneath the exhaustion, that she would eventually find a place that didn't swallow her whole. Act 8. The Collapse. Snow returned overnight, falling thick and wet against the windows of her aunt's apartment. Aiko woke to the smell of miso simmering in the kitchen and the sound of her young cousins squabbling over slippers. Her body felt heavy, as if the weight of the night had settled into her bones. She rose slowly, wrapped her coat around her, and prepared for another long walk through the city's hard silence. She told herself she would keep trying until she found something, anything, steady enough to cling to. She visited a small clothing shop near the edge of uptown, its windows lined with cheap coats and colorful scarves that fluttered in the draft. She stepped inside, the bell above the door chiming softly. A middle-aged woman greeted her with a polite smile, asking what she needed. Aiko explained she was looking for work and listed her experience: sewing, mending, organizing inventory, customer service. The woman nodded along, her face unreadable. "Leave your information," she said. "We'll be in touch if we need help." Aiko thanked her, though she already recognized the finality in the woman's tone. As she left the shop, she caught her reflection in the window, eyes dull with exhaustion, cheeks hollow from stress, hair wind-tangled despite the neat ribbon. She barely recognized herself. By noon, she stood outside the department store where she had once applied, the same one that dismissed her without looking at her resume. She stared at the tall glass doors, trying to summon the courage to walk inside again. She didn't move. She couldn't bring herself to hear another no from the same place. The shame settled cold against her ribs. Instead, she turned toward the small store where she occasionally worked part-time, a cramped shop run by a Korean couple who depended on seasonal help. When she stepped through the door, the owner looked up from the counter with a frown. "You didn't come in yesterday," he said. "I wasn't scheduled. We needed someone to sort boxes. I called your aunt. She said you were out." Aiko forced a steady exhale. "I didn't know." The owner set down his pen. Business is slow. We can only keep so many workers. Family helps first. You understand. Those words stung. She heard the truth inside them. She wasn't family, not truly. Not the kind that earned loyalty or security. We won't need you for a while, he added gently. Maybe in spring. Her stomach tightened. Thank you for letting me know. The disappointment threatened to split her open, but she kept her expression still. She stepped back into the street, where snow had begun to fall again, swirling in thin sheets across the pavement. Her breath hung in front of her like small ghosts. She wandered aimlessly for hours, barely feeling the cold. When she finally returned to her aunt's building, the hallway felt narrower than usual. Her aunt met her at the door with a look that knitted sympathy and impatience together. You're home early, her aunt said. I lost the job. Her aunt sighed, rubbing her temples. We have too many mouths here. You must find stability, Aiko. You cannot rely on others forever. Aiko swallowed hard. I'm trying. Trying is not enough, her aunt said, not unkindly. You must act. Aiko retreated into her room before the ache in her chest could overflow. She closed the door gently, letting her forehead rest against the wood. A quiet tremor moved through her shoulders. She had worked so hard to stay composed, to stay small, to stay acceptable. It no longer mattered. The next afternoon, a small crowd gathered in front of the grocery store near her aunt's home. Aiko walked past them, clutching her coat tighter. She kept her eyes lowered, wanting to slip by unnoticed. But a woman standing near the entrance pointed at her. That's her, the woman said loudly. The Jap girl who slapped me. Aiko froze. A ripple moved through the crowd. The woman's voice lifted with the confidence of someone who believed the city stood behind her. She's dangerous, the woman continued. People like her. Aiko snapped before she could stop herself. You should be ashamed. Her voice carried across the street, clear and sharp, cutting through the winter air. The woman's eyes widened. The crowd went still. Aiko stepped closer, not to intimidate, but because she refused to shrink. You insulted me, she said. You expected me to accept it quietly. I won't. A murmur spread through the onlookers, some disapproving, others surprised. The woman sputtered, unable to form a retort strong enough to reclaim her authority. Aiko didn't wait for her to recover. She turned, walking away with her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. When she reached the river, she collapsed onto a bench, her breath coming in uneven waves. Her hands trembled in her lap. She knew she had reached some unseen edge within herself, an edge she could no longer push beyond. The last of her composure had cracked open. She felt the collapse fully now, the loss of work, the loss of shelter, the loss of belonging, the loss of the version of herself who once believed she could survive anything. As twilight settled over the city, she stared at the frozen water and let the exhaustion wash through her. She didn't cry, not because she felt strong, but because something inside her had gone numb. She whispered to the stillness around her, I don't know how much more I can carry. And for the first time since arriving in Chicago, she didn't try to answer herself with hope. Act 9. The basement where the truth lives. Snow thickened by evening, turning the streets into pale corridors and muffling the city's usual clatter. Aiko walked with no destination in mind, boots sinking into the soft white crust with every step. The cold pressed through her coat, yet she kept moving because stopping meant feeling, and feeling meant breaking apart in a way she wasn't sure she could recover from. Her breath came out in heavy clouds as she followed the river, turning down unfamiliar streets until the lights grew dimmer and the houses older. She had nowhere to go, nowhere she felt welcome. By the time she reached a small wooden church tucked between two shuttered storefronts, her feet had gone numb. A sign outside read "Community Meeting, All Welcome." The glow from the basement windows spilled a warm gold onto the snow. She hesitated at the entrance, thinking she would only rest a moment before continuing her wandering. But fatigue wore her down. She walked slowly down the steps and opened the basement door. Warmth rushed over her. Voices drifted in gentle waves, low, familiar, unmistakably Japanese. A circle of people sat in folding chairs, bundled in worn coats and scarves, steam rising from mugs gripped between cold fingers. They looked up as she entered, most offering soft nods or quiet hellos. No one asked who she was. No one asked if she belonged. A small woman near the heater waved her over. "Come sit," she said gently. "You look frozen." Aiko obeyed, settling into a chair beside her. A mug of hot tea appeared in her hands a moment later. The heat nearly burned her palms, but she clung to it anyway, grateful for the sensation that reminded her she was still alive. The group resumed their conversation. They spoke of Tule Lake, of Poston, of Gila River, of Heart Mountain, names that Aiko carried like old bruises. One man described the way dust storms rattled the Baroque walls at night. Another woman confessed she still jumped whenever she heard boots on gravel. A younger girl talked about the first time she saw a guard tower through the fence and realized freedom was a story she had been told, not a truth she lived. For the first time since arriving in Chicago, Aiko felt her breath slow. Her shoulders loosened, just a fraction. These were her people, not perfect, not whole, but familiar in the way survivors often are. Their voices held the same timbre of loss she carried silently. Soon the conversation shifted. People spoke of resettlement, of the cold shock of new cities that looked nothing like the lives they left behind. One woman with silver hair tied in a bun said she applied to 42 jobs before someone finally offered her work cleaning offices at night. "They said I was smart," the woman said with a tired smile. "Said I had a talent for numbers, that I learned fast, that I'd make something big one day. Funny how words disappear when the war is over." Laughter rippled through the group. Not joyful laughter, knowing laughter, sharp and weary. Aiko felt something inside her unclench. Those words mirrored her life almost exactly. All her childhood she had been told she was capable, gifted even. People expected her to build a future bright enough to lift her whole family. Yet here she was, unable to hold a job long enough to buy her own dinner. As she listened, she realized she wasn't alone in that grief. The city that forgot her had forgotten them too. They were all navigating lives that refused to match the promises they once believed. A man near the far wall, small, wiry, eyes like burning coal, spoke up next. He explained how his wife cried each night in the boarding house because the neighbors slammed their doors whenever she walked by. "They told me she'd go far," he said. "They said she had a mind for business. She can't even get hired washing dishes." Aiko's chest tightened. Their failures weren't personal. Their losses weren't individual. They were the echoes of a system that had rewritten their lives without apology. The group continued longer than Aiko expected, voices rising and falling like waves against shore. No one took notes. No one argued. They simply shared the truth that Chicago refused to see. Eventually, the woman beside her leaned closer. "You can come back," she whispered. "Whenever you want. We meet twice a week." Aiko nodded. She didn't trust her voice enough to speak. By the time the meeting ended, the air had warmed enough to soften the chill in her bones. People packed their coats, pulled on boots, and offered her quiet smiles as they passed, acknowledgement, welcome, understanding. Not pity. She stepped out into the snow again, her breath rising in faint clouds. The cold still hurt, but something within her felt steadier. Connected. Rooted. She walked without fear of getting lost, letting her steps guide her toward home, if not a place, then at least a direction. Her collapse hadn't ended her. It had led her to the basement where truth lived, carried by voices that matched her own. And as she walked through the dim streets, she whispered softly to the night, "I'm still here." The snowflakes fell around her like a quiet blessing. Act 10. The mirror she finally faces. Morning crept in slowly, gray and hesitant, as if unsure whether the city deserved another day of light. Aiko woke before anyone else in her aunt's apartment, sitting upright in the narrow bed with the blanket pulled around her waist. Her body still carried the echo of last night's meeting, the warmth of those voices, the gravity of their stories, the way truth had finally been spoken aloud without fear. She felt changed in a way she couldn't yet name. Not stronger, but steadier, as if some long-hidden rhythm inside her had begun to align again. Her aunt's apartment stirred awake behind thin walls. Water boiled in the kitchen. A child coughed in the hallway. Someone opened and shut a door twice in search of misplaced gloves. Aiko rose, washed her face, tied her ribbon neatly in her hair, and stepped out into the morning with a careful resolve. The cold struck her cheeks sharply, but it didn't feel like an enemy today. She breathed into her scarf and let her steps carry her toward the part of the city she had avoided for days. Caleb's workplace sat on a corner overlooking the frozen river. Inside, men laughed loudly, the kind of laughter that aimed to fill every space it entered. Aiko waited at the entrance until Caleb noticed her through the glass. He brightened instantly, waving her in with a familiarity that made her chest tighten. As she stepped inside, warmth enveloped her, but so did the weight of everything she had been carrying silently. "You came," he said, slipping an arm around her shoulders. "Thought you were hiding from me." She stepped out of his hold gently. "I wasn't hiding. I needed space." Caleb frowned, not angrily at first, but confused. "Space from what?" "From everything," she said quietly. "From you too." His face changed at that. The confusion sharpened. "I've been helping you." "Yes," she said. "And sometimes you've helped me feel safe. But other times you make me feel small." He scoffed softly. "Small? I treat you better than most men in the city would." "That's the problem," she replied. "You think I should be grateful for the bare minimum." A few of his coworkers glanced toward them, sensing tension. Caleb straightened, trying to regain control of the moment. "You're overthinking," he muttered. "You get too emotional about things." Aiko felt something inside her settle, not with anger, but clarity. She realized how many times she had swallowed her own instincts to keep the peace, how often she had softened herself to fit his comfort. She realized she had been shrinking long before she arrived in Chicago, long before she met him. She had made herself smaller because survival demanded it. But she didn't want to continue living in that shape. "I won't be with someone who talks over me," she said. "Or someone who calls me exotic. Or someone who thinks taking care of me means owning me." Caleb stared at her, stunned. "You're ending this?" he said. "Just like that?" She nodded. "Yes." His jaw clenched. "You don't even have anywhere else to go." "I'll find a way," she said gently. "I always do." He took a step toward her, then stopped when he realized she wasn't afraid. His eyes darted between her and the door, as if choosing which direction his temper wanted to move. But the moment passed, and he turned away, brushing her off with a muttered curse she didn't bother listening to. Aiko left the building with her heart pounding, not from fear but from the shock of hearing her own voice stand firm. The cold air rushed into her lungs, startling in its sharpness. She walked along the river until the buildings thinned and the snow quieted beneath her boots. Her mind replayed the words she had spoken, simple, steady, honest. Words she had been too afraid to say for weeks. Or maybe years. When she reached home, the apartment buzzed with midday energy. Her aunt stirred a pot of soup. Children argued over pieces of chalk. A neighbor dropped off extra bread with a polite bow. Aiko sat at the small kitchen table with her mother's latest letter resting in her lap. She unfolded it slowly, smoothing the creases with careful fingertips. Her mother's handwriting curved in familiar arcs. "We love you. We trust you. You do not need to rush. The world will ask more of you than it gives. But you are still you, and that is enough to begin again." Aiko pressed the letter to her chest, feeling its warmth spread through her like a quiet fire. She wasn't fixed. She wasn't suddenly confident. But she felt anchored again, as if her mother's words reached across the miles to gather her back into herself. That night, she returned to the church basement. She stepped inside quietly, bowing her head in greeting as the others welcomed her with gentle smiles. When she sat among them, the heaviness inside her shifted, no longer a burden, but a truth she could carry openly. She listened to their stories again, and this time she didn't hide her reactions. She nodded. She breathed with them. She let her heart sit in the open. For the first time since the city tried to swallow her, she felt her reflection align with the person she wanted to become. Someone honest. Someone grounded. Someone who chose her own path, even when it narrowed to a thin thread. She looked around the room and whispered to herself, barely audible. "I'm still growing. And I'm still here." Her voice no longer trembled. Act 11. The return of her own voice. The next morning carried a softer light, a pale gold that filtered through the frost on the window panes and warmed the narrow room where Aiko slept. She woke with a strange calm, the kind that arrived only after a long storm finally exhausted itself. Her body still ached from weeks of tension, but something inside her had shifted. A quiet steadiness replaced the frantic need to outrun her own life. She rose slowly, tied her ribbon with deliberate care, and stepped into the hallway with her shoulders a little straighter than before. Her aunt watched her from the kitchen doorway, hands resting on her hips. The usual scrutiny softened into something gentler. "You look different today," her aunt observed. "I feel different," Aiko said. Her aunt nodded, as if she had been waiting for this without knowing how to ask for it. "Take whatever time you need this morning," she said. "The children can fold their own laundry today." It was the closest thing to grace her aunt had offered since Aiko arrived. After breakfast, Aiko wrapped her scarf around her neck and walked through the crisp air, choosing a path that led her away from the places that had exhausted her and toward the neighborhoods that felt alive with possibility. The city carried the usual noise, streetcars rattling, vendors calling out prices, but she no longer moved through it with resignation. She moved with intention. People glanced at her the same way they always had, but she no longer shrank in response. She met their eyes, even if briefly, and kept walking. She stopped by a small sewing shop tucked between a grocer and a shoemaker. The front window displayed hand-dyed scarves and neatly stitched children's dresses, each piece crafted with a gentleness she recognized instinctively. She stepped inside. The space felt warm, lined wall-to-wall with fabrics in muted blues, soft greens, and earthy browns. A woman in her late 50s stood at the counter, trimming loose threads from a bundle of wool. "Can I help you?" the woman asked. Aiko inhaled deeply. "I'm looking for work." The woman studied her face, not with suspicion but with curiosity. "Do you sew?" "Yes," Aiko said. "Very well. Show me." The woman placed a worn jacket on the counter. Aiko threaded a needle quickly, her hands finding their rhythm with practiced ease. She stitched a torn seam with small, tight movements, her fingers guiding the cloth the way her mother once taught her when she was little. When she finished, the seam sat flat and even, as if it had never been damaged. The woman nodded. "That's good work," she said quietly. "Stay for the afternoon. Help me finish the orders." Aiko blinked, almost disbelieving. "You're hiring me?" "I'm trying you," the woman replied. "Hiring comes later, when I know you'll stay." It wasn't a promise, but it felt like a beginning. A real one. She spent the afternoon sewing buttons, hemming trousers, sorting fabrics by color and texture. The shop smelled of cedar and wool, a scent that reminded her of the camp's clothing repair room but without the ache attached to it. She worked quietly, but not silently. The woman asked her questions about her family, about where she grew up, about her sewing experience. Aiko answered honestly, without shrinking, without apologizing for her past. The woman listened calmly, as if Aiko's history was simply another thread in the fabric of her life rather than a stain she needed to rub out. When the shop closed for the day, the woman handed her a small envelope with a modest wage. "Come back tomorrow," she said. "If you want." Aiko stepped into the evening air with her hands warmed by the envelope and her heart warmed by the invitation. She didn't head home immediately. Instead, she made her way to the church basement. When she arrived, the room buzzed with conversation, familiar faces clustered in small circles, steam rising from metal kettles at the back of the room. The woman who had offered her a seat days earlier waved her over. "You came back," she said with a smile. Aiko sat beside her. "I needed to." One man shared news of finding work at a warehouse. Another woman spoke about her daughter's schooling and the challenges of learning English. A young couple talked about saving enough money to bring their parents from the coast. Their voices carried sorrow, but also resilience. The kind that didn't announce itself loudly. The kind that lived quietly in the body and kept people moving despite the heaviness. When the conversation naturally shifted toward her, Aiko spoke with a steadiness she hadn't known she possessed. "I found work today," she said. It's small, but it's something. And I think it will grow. The group nodded warmly, their approval soft but sincere. She felt the warmth of belonging press into her chest, anchoring her in a way she hadn't experienced since arriving in the city. Later, as the meeting came to a close, she stayed behind to help fold chairs and sweep crumbs from the floor. The simple tasks felt purposeful, grounding. When she stepped back out into the night, the snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes drifting in slow spirals under the street lamps. She paused beneath the light, lifting her face to the cold, letting the flakes land and melt on her cheeks. Her breath rose in a gentle cloud. She didn't feel lost. Not that night. She whispered into the quiet. I'm finding myself again. And this time, she knew it was true. Thank you for Act 12. The city that has to learn her name. By late winter, the snow had thinned into slush along the sidewalks, and the river carried sheets of melting ice that cracked softly as they drifted downstream. The city felt a little less hostile, not because it changed, but because Aiko no longer approached it with the same fragile hope she carried when she first stepped off the train. She moved through the streets with a steadier stride, her shoulders relaxed, her eyes level. She knew now that belonging wasn't gifted by the city. It was built, slowly, thread by thread, until it could hold its own weight. Each morning she opened the sewing shop with the widow who owned it, sweeping the floors and preparing the day's work. The shop smelled of warm fabric and cedar oil, a scent that settled in her clothes and followed her home each evening. She mended coats for laborers, hemmed dresses for office clerks, stitched tiny repairs into children's winter clothes. Her hands moved with quiet confidence. Customers soon began asking for her specifically, the gentle seamstress, they called her. The nickname made her smile in a way that reached her eyes. The widow paid her fairly, sometimes slipping extra bills into her envelope when the shop had a good week. Don't argue, she said whenever Aiko protested. You earned it. The words softened something in Aiko's chest that had been hard for months. She stayed late some evenings to help reorganize patterns and fabric bolts, bringing tea to the back room while the widow shared stories of her husband, her daughter, her life before the war. Aiko listened without comparison, without shrinking. She no longer felt like a visitor borrowing space. At her aunt's apartment, the energy shifted as well. Her aunt still spoke bluntly, still corrected small things, still maintained her brisk ways, but something warmer had taken root beneath the surface. Aiko contributed rent, small amounts, but enough to exist as someone responsible rather than someone dependent. The children showed her their drawings and asked her to help repair torn mittens. Evenings no longer pressed on her like a burden. They simply passed, steady as breathing. One afternoon, while returning from errands, Aiko ran into Kenji outside the small market. He smiled warmly, his coat dusted with flour from the laundry shop where he had begun helping after school. I heard you found a place to work, he said. I'm glad. Thank you, she replied. I'm finding my footing. He hesitated, then added, if you ever want company, someone who understands, you could come by for tea. Aiko paused, then smiled gently. I might, she said, neither rejecting nor promising anything. She wasn't afraid of her own answer this time. As winter stretched into early spring, the church basement remained her anchor. The meetings continued, stories shared, wounds unpacked, small victories celebrated. Aiko helped serve tea, set chairs, translate notices for elders who struggled with English. She grew into the rhythm of the room, not as a visitor, but as a voice among other voices. During one meeting, she read aloud a letter from her mother, her voice steady, her words received with warmth and understanding. When she finished, the room hummed with quiet affirmation. She felt herself open in ways she didn't think possible months before. One evening, after leaving the church, she walked home along the river path. The ice had loosened, drifting in sheets that bumped gently against the banks. The lamps cast golden halos across the water. She stopped halfway across a bridge, resting her hands on the railing. The wind toyed with her ribbon, tugging it softly. Lights from downtown flickered on the surface of the river, scattered and trembling, yet beautiful. She looked out across the dark water and thought of Tule Lake, the dust storms, the long lines for meals, the nights when the barracks groaned under the weight of wind. She thought of the girl she had been, the one who believed she had to earn her place simply by staying silent. She thought of the young woman who stepped off the train into Chicago with a suitcase full of hope and a heart full of fear. She didn't erase either version of herself. She carried both. "I survived," she whispered. "I'm still becoming." Her voice felt steady, almost warm, drifting across the river like a small lantern released into the night. The city still held its cruelties. People still stared sometimes. Doors still closed too quickly. But Aiko no longer measured her worth by those rejections. She had carved out a life, not grand, not easy, but hers. A life sown slowly from the remnants she refused to abandon. She turned from the railing and walked toward home, the snow crunching under her boots in a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. She passed a group of women chatting on a stoop, a child dragging a sled behind him, a man sweeping salt across his storefront. No one looked at her twice. And yet, somehow, it mattered that she walked among them with her chin slightly lifted. The city hadn't learned her name yet. But it would. She would teach it carefully, patiently, one stitch at a time. And as the night settled over Chicago, she carried her voice with her, not loud, not blazing, but steady and unmistakably her own. Thank you for listening to Stories from Camp. This episode, The City That Forgot Her Name, is one chapter in the long, quiet story of how Japanese Americans tried to rebuild their lives after the war, carrying both the dust of the camps and the strength that kept them moving forward. If you want to hear the next chapter, you can keep listening here or find the full series on our channel. For more Japanese American history told with care and accuracy, visit redressradio.com. We create these stories for free, to remember the people who lived through the camps and to keep this history alive. If you'd like to support the project, like, subscribe, or share the series with someone who wants to learn. Rest well. And remember the camps.